Dive into chapter 10. And really, what we're going to be focusing on in this chapter is citizens' beliefs and how we get those beliefs, what our values are as a nation, and some public opinion polling pieces because it's really closely correlated, with beliefs. So, citizens' attitude towards government and towards one another are influenced by the way that citizens interpret core American values. Americans really have widely different views on how the government ought to govern. For example, most citizens agree that the government should provide an economic safety net for citizens, like some type of welfare system that could help those unfortunate people who've lost their jobs, who maybe have fallen to ill health, or found themselves without shelter for some reason. However, citizens differ greatly on what actually defines poor and at what point the government should reach out and help people and what type of recipients as well as what type of social help should be given to these people. Similarly, nearly all Americans oppose murder and all want to correctly identify the killer before punishment is administered. However, we differ on how the government might prosecute the accused and what punishment a guilty defendant might receive. Those are just two examples that we share many of the same core values as Americans, but the way that we see those illustrated or the way that we see those come to fruition, we vary greatly on. So often we describe our differing views on a political spectrum. Okay, think of a line. On the right side of the spectrum, you find conservatives. Okay, hence why we call conservatives the right. And on the left side of the spectrum, you find liberals. Hence why we call liberals the left. In the example of a murderer, okay, conservatives would push hard for punishment of criminals. Liberals would want the government to provide welfare to people at a higher, though still impoverished, income level, and they would desire leniency from the government on punishments. Okay, Americans also have strongly held common views that form the that form the country's political culture. And our political culture, we just define political culture as the set of attitudes that shape our own political behavior. The cornerstone of our political culture really is individualism, equal opportunity, free enterprise, and the rule of law. And we're going to really look at those four things a little bit more in depth now. So let's talk about individualism. Individualism is just defined as the belief in the fundamental worth and importance of the individual. It's been a value of the American social and political life since our nation's beginning. It's rooted in the Enlightenment philosophy that helped shape the American government. The inalienable rights of the individual comes before the government, and they are not given by the government; they are given by God. Those natural rights. Okay. Our individual liberties are protected in the Bill of Rights. Our individual liberty to practice a religion or not practice a religion. Our individual liberty to speak what we want to speak. Okay, our individual liberty to protest, etc. Those are all in the Bill of Rights. Individualism is really a tension with other social values Americans share, such as the respect for the common good and the protection of or public interest. If everyone sought only his or her interests, though, society as a whole would become fractured. Okay, so everyone just can't constantly seek their own interests. Okay, the principle of enlightened self-interest is what it's called. Is basically the belief that one's interests are best served when the good of the group is considered, balancing the drive for individualism with the realities of social life. So certainly, I have goals. Okay, one of my goals right now is that I'm working on my doctoral degree. Okay, but just because that's a goal doesn't mean that I don't care about you as my students or don't care about the other responsibilities I have. I balance those things out. Yes, I have a self-interest in earning my degree, but I also have an interest in you being successful in this course, not only passing the exam, but also just really knowing more about our government and about the issues that you and I face every day as Americans. And so I kind of balance that self interest out with my own individualism. Different interpretations of individualism create a spectrum of views between self centered individualism, which places the individual's interest above the group's interest, and wants little interference from the government, to enlightened self interest, which sacrifices some individual freedom for the greater good and expects the government to promote the public good. So, at the core of our values, one of those values is individualism. And certainly, the way that those play out are different for each of us. Some of us may be more what we would consider self centered when it comes to individualism, and others may be more enlightened, okay? Or there's a balance really between those two. So that's really what we're talking about when we talk about individualism as a core American value. Another core American value is equality of opportunity. So Thomas Jefferson included the line in the Declaration of Independence that all men are created equal. The purpose of the line was not to suggest that every man was absolutely equal to every other in ability of character or any other measure. That's taking the line to be too literal, okay? The purpose of the line was to emphasize the equal rights of people to pursue life, liberty, and happiness. However, not until the ratification of the 14th Amendment was there a national constitutional demand for the state governments to guarantee the equal protection of the citizens. Okay, now I'm going to pause here for a minute and we're going to talk about the 14th Amendment. Why? Because it is an amendment that you're going to hear over and over and over and over and over again this year. And it is probably one of the most important amendments to understand. It's utilized in a lot of Supreme Court cases that we'll look at. And it's just one that you need to understand. So I'm going to pause for a second here and I'm going to talk briefly about it before I keep going on with our core values. So the 14th Amendment is one of three what we call Civil War amendments. Why? Because they're passed right after the Civil War. The 13th, the first one, passed abolishing slavery. The 14th guaranteed equal opportunity and equal rights. The 15th guarantees all men are able to vote. Some people will say the 15th Amendment guarantees that all black men can vote. No. I mean, that was the intention behind it, but it does not specifically say all African Americans now have the ability to vote. It is just simply saying that all men have the right to vote and it can't be discriminated on that right based on their color, okay? So anyways, that's not what I'm talking about though right now. I'm talking about the 14th Amendment. So there are four sections of the 14th Amendment, and section 2, 3, and 4 are not important to you in GOPO because they're all historical things and they apply to the Confederacy after the war, and you're not going to study that. Not this year at least. You'll study it with me in APUSH. What's important to us in GOPO is section 1, and I'm going to read that. All persons born or naturalized in the United States are subject to the jurisdiction thereof, are citizens of the United States and the state where they reside. No state shall make or enforce a law which shall abridge the privileges and immunities of a citizen of the United States. Nor shall any state deprive a person of life, liberty, or property without due process of law, nor deny any person within its jurisdiction the equal protection of the laws. There's a lot of stuff going on here, okay? So basically, the historical reason behind the 14th Amendment was that, okay, so the Confederate States are going to be coming back into the Union at this point, okay? And what's going to happen is that these states, the northern states, are worried that some of these southern states might try to take away some of the rights of these newly freed African Americans, okay, who are no longer slaves but now are free persons. And so they passed the 14th Amendment to try to protect them. So the first line in that says that all persons born or naturalized in the United States. That means that either you were born here, so that makes you an automatic citizen, which probably most of you were born in the United States, so you're automatic citizens, or you were naturalized here. Okay, well, what does that mean? That means that you became a legal citizen through the naturalization process. And that's looked different at different points in history, but today it involves passing a citizenship test, which is very hard, and going through a lot of different paperwork and interviews in order to become a citizen of the United States. And once you do that, you become a legal or naturalized citizen and you're guaranteed the rights. So that's the first thing. Hey, Kona, nice to see you. Um, so they're saying that all persons born or naturalized in the United States are subject to the jurisdictions of and are citizens of the United States and of the state. Now, why do they have to say they're citizens of the United States and the state? Duh. Well, that's because they wanted to prevent states from saying that people that were black were not citizens of those states. Because what this is guaranteeing is that no matter what color you are, no matter what gender you have certain rights that are guaranteed to you in the Constitution and now are double guaranteed to you at this United States government, federal government level, as well as the state level. Because what the 14th Amendment does is that it is basically saying that all of your rights that are listed in the Bill of Rights, okay, in the Constitution, as well as the regular articles themselves, those are your rights at the federal level and the state level, okay? Those are your rights at the federal level and state level. Because before, the state governments would say, well, at the federal level, you have a right to free speech, but that's not in our state constitution. I'm just giving you an example when it came to, especially in the South with African Americans. That's not in our constitution, so thus you're not given that right, okay? Well, the 14th Amendment corrects that. So it's basically saying that if you're a citizen or you're a naturalized citizen in the United States, well, then you get the rights that are guaranteed to everybody else, okay? It's different if you're not a citizen or you're not a naturalized citizen of the United States, okay? So there are 3 clauses that are in here, okay? And they correspond to the words, okay? And it's important to understand all 3 clauses of the 14th Amendment. The first is privileges and immunities. The second is the due process clause, and the third is equal protection. So let's talk about the privileges and immunities. It says, no state shall make or enforce any law which shall abridge the privileges and immunities of citizens of the United States. Well, that just goes back to the privileges and immunities clause in the in the federalism article of the Constitution, okay? And so what we're saying here is that if you give, in the context of the time, if you give white men this privilege and immunity, you have to give black men that same privilege and immunity, okay? The second clause here talks about the due process, okay? And it says that, nor shall any state deprive a person of life, liberty, or property without due process of law. Now, what is due process? Well, that's another term that's really important for you to understand, okay? And so, due process, okay, is a term you're going to see over and over and over again. It's literally all the processes from the time that you are accused of a crime to being told what your rights are, to be given access to a lawyer, to be given a fair and speedy trial, to be given a jury by your peers, to not being given excessive bail or cruel and unusual punishment. The whole process from the time that you're accused of the crime until the time that you're sentenced, okay, or you're found guilty or not guilty. All of those procedures that are guaranteed to you as rights in the Bill of Rights, that's due process, okay? So what we're saying here is that you can't take someone's life, liberty, or property away without giving them due process of the law. So if you're going to accuse someone of doing something, you have to give them due process of the law. It doesn't matter if they're accused of doing a really horrible crime. I'll take the example of someone that's a serial killer, okay? Maybe they've been accused of murdering 32 people, and maybe the evidence is pretty clear that they did it. Heck, maybe they even confessed to that. It does not matter. They're still a citizen of the United States, and they still get due process of law. Okay, it does not matter how bad the crime you're accused of committing is, and of course there are very heinous crimes. Okay, there are things that certain people get very upset by, but at the end of the day, you're guaranteed due process of law. Why? You might be saying, like, Mr. May, for some things you should just go to jail. Okay, and you might be wondering, like, why is that the case that everybody gets due process of law. Well, think about it. If we start saying that, well, there are certain crimes that if you're accused of, that you're just not going to get due process of law, what happens when you're falsely accused of that crime? Okay? What happens when the evidence really isn't there? And so, yeah, you might dislike certain crimes that people do, but at the end of the day, everybody gets to have due process, because if not, well, it would be a very scary government that we'd live under. Okay, and so the next thing says, and the last part is the equal protection clause, and this is probably the most important clause of the 14th Amendment. It says, nor deny to any person within its jurisdiction the equal protection of the laws. And this is so important for you to understand, because basically what it's saying here is that you have to protect people under your laws equally, okay? So if a black person is being lynched in the town park by the KKK, again, I'm using the example of the 1860s here, then the police have to step in and help that person. You have to protect that person just like you would protect another person. Okay? Now, in modern lights, we have used that for a lot of different cases. So, for example, in the Supreme Court case Obergefell versus Hodges in 2014, that overturned all the laws in the United States that banned gay marriage, they utilized the Equal Protection Clause of the 14th Amendment to make that decision, because they said you can't tell couples who are a man and a woman that they can get married, but then turn around and tell a woman and another woman, or a man and another man, that they can't get married, because that's not giving them equal protection of your marriage laws. Okay? So equal protection of the laws means that whatever the laws are, we have to equally protect everyone in the state with those laws. We can't discriminate on them. So the Privileges and Immunities Clause, the Due Process Clause, and the Equal Protection Clause are the three parts of the 14th Amendment. And it's really important to understand. Now, going back to your core American values, we were talking about that because it relates to our core American value of equal opportunity. The 14th Amendment protects you so that you can have equal opportunity, no matter if you're white, black, no matter if you're gay or straight or transgender, no matter where you came from, no matter if you're a natural born citizen or not, you are guaranteed all of those specific rights that are given to you in the Constitution. Just like the states, the federal government once had unequal practices. The federal government provided remedies to fix that, though. For example, Title VII of the Civil Rights Act of 1964 prohibits employment discrimination based on race, sex, national origin, color, or religion. In the 1960s, Congress created the Equal Opportunity Commission to combat discrimination in hiring or firing of employers. So it's one of those things that really has expanded throughout time to really ensure that more people are granted equality in the United States. Core American value is free enterprise. So most colonists came to America for economic reasons, jobs, opportunity, or greater distance from a government that might inhibit their economic success. The same year that colonists declared independence, a Scottish economist and philosopher named Adam Smith wrote a famous book called The Wealth of Nations. I cannot tell you how important this is to understand. You're literally going to hear this in every class of your social studies for the next 4 years, okay? And his book was basically an examination of the government's role in the economy. Smith felt that the government should be primarily concerned with protecting its people from invasion and with maintaining law and order, and should really only intervene in with the natural flow of human economic interaction to protect the people. So basically, what he said was that businesses and merchants would succeed or fall based on their decisions and the decisions of the consumer. This is capitalism that he's a proponent of and really theorizing here. Okay, he says that not the government. The government shouldn't be deciding if a business succeeds or fails. It's the businesses and the consumers who do that. Government really should take a laissez-faire, hands-off approach. We talked about that in the previous chapter. And an invisible hand would be guided by the consumers and producers, which would be regulated over time. So let me explain what this idea of the invisible hand is. Okay, so let's say that a in LaVale, a new high-end toy store comes to town, okay? And they market themselves, they put themselves up, let's just say they put themselves in the plaza up there where Ollie's is at. And they market themselves as high-end toys. And that kind of store, the type of toys that you're dealing with in there are probably toys that are all at least, let's just throw out $50 a piece, okay? So they're not toys that you're going to buy every day, okay? Um, and so store are all $50 a piece, okay, you basically have to have, some money, okay? You have to be pretty wealthy to buy toys there, okay? Well, knowing the economy in Allegheny County, certainly they'll have some sales, but it's not going to be a toy store that a whole lot of people are going to go and buy from, okay? That's that invisible hand because the consumers make up the invisible hand, because the consumers are going to say, look, that's cool that we have the access to these toys here, but they're just too expensive. And so while the businessmen might make a couple sales, they're not going to make near enough of those sales to be able to stay open. So after some time, maybe a couple months, maybe a year or so, that business is going to go out of business. The government never said, hey, you can't put your store in there. The government never said, hey, you have to go out of business. And the government never told the consumers, hey, you can or can't shop there. What made that whole process happen, where the businessman decided he wanted to put a high-end toy store there, and where the consumers in Allegheny County decided they weren't going to shop there, was the invisible hand of the economy that Adam Smith is talking about. So instead of the government making those decisions, the people do. That's capitalism, okay? The businessman had the idea that he wanted to make money, okay? We all we all want to make money, okay? We all have an innate greed, okay? And there are consumers that, some of them, who wanted those products. But the vast majority of the consumers in the area did not want those products. And so the business went out of business. The government wasn't involved in that. That was the invisible hand of the economy. So we call this whole approach to the economy free enterprise, or you just hear it called capitalism. Okay? If you hear to that approach, you are a free market advocate. Why do we call it free market or free enterprise? Because you and I are free to make our own consumer decisions, and businesses are free to make their own business decisions. The government's not deciding it. The opposite of this would be a command economy, where the government commands you to do something. This is a free market economy, and we have that in the United States. Today, even most strict free market advocates believe in things like a minimum wage and some controls, though, to keep the air we breathe clean. So our government does get involved in the economy, some, okay? But it for the most part, the economy regulates itself because of you and I. During the Progressive Era and the New Deal, the state and federal governments began to regulate industry, minimum wage, child labor, and fairness in the workplace. Those were all examples of the government intervening in the economy in some way, okay? But it wasn't taking over the economy. In the last 100 years, government involvement in the marketplace has increased to protect workers and guarantee economic successes overall. We all agree that we don't think that children should be forced to go and work in factories. But unfortunately, because of the greed of factory owners, they were being forced to, and they were being paid really small. So it took the government, who had the power to do so, to go in and outlaw it and force those companies not to do that anymore. Conservatives tend to want a government to stay out of the way of business and want fewer burdensome regulations on business, okay? As a result, small business owners and corporate leaders tend to vote conservative or Republican in the United States. Liberals tend to see the government regulation as necessary to ensure fairness and safety, and labor union leaders and hourly workers tend to side with the liberals or the Democratic Party. The next, American value is the rule of law. So the rule of law is just defined as the principle of a government that establishes laws that apply equally to all members of society and prevents the rule and whims of leaders who see themselves as above the law. So the law applies to all of us, no matter how rich you are, no matter what position you're in. That's the rule of law. In many foreign governments today, whatever dictator happens to be in charge will make most of the decisions in the government, regardless of public policy or public will. including when and even if there will be elections. The United States Constitution, though, dictates a presidential election every 4 years under the rule of law, and thus the United States has never missed an election and never had an issue with the transfer of power. Ever since 1790, when President Washington was inaugurated, we have had every 4 years a presidential election because we have the rule of law that prevents things like dictatorships coming up. And then we have limited government, which we've talked about before. Um, it's basically the idea that it's a government that's kept under control by law and by checks and balances and separation of power. We've talked about that. The Constitution is filled with many devices and designs to prevent the government action from becoming too powerful. The Democrats, for nearly a century, were the party of limited government. However, during the Progressive Era, the New Deal, and the Great Society, they became more accepting of government action for the greater good. Republicans, once the party that used the government to free the slaves, to build the railroad, and to create state colleges, now desire less government involvement on other matters.